Hi, this is your host Sapna Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Zach Lloyd, founder and CEO of Warp. Zach, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Zach, since this is the first time we're talking to each other, I would love to know a bit about the company itself, and also since you're a founder, tell us, what is the company all about and why you created it.
Sure. So the basics of the company are we started in June 2020. The company's name is Warp. The mission of the company is actually pretty broad. So it's to elevate developer productivity, and specifically what we're focused on are rebuilding products that developers use every day. And the product that we're going to market with is a reinvention of the terminal. So terminal is, it's kind of unique. It's one of the two tools where if you walk by any developer's desk, they're going to have a terminal open. They'll probably also have like some sort of code editor open. As a tool, it's something that is hard to use. It's hard to learn. It's intimidating for new developers. It's something that really hasn't changed much at all in the last, I don't know, 40 years. And so, we see a big opportunity if we can make a version of the terminal that brings its power to a much wider range of developers to do something that meaningfully impacts developer productivity. And so that's kind of the root of the mission. The other big thing that we're trying to do with the terminal is to make it collaborative and make it work for teams. And that ties in a bit with my background. So I used to be a principal engineer at Google. I used to lead engineering on the Google Docs suite. And that experience made me just believe very deeply that if you take any kind of application that is sort of local desktop software and connect it to the cloud, make it work for teams, there's going to be a big productivity boost. So those were like the main product ideas that we have and what we're working on building right now.
So when you're trying to reinvent Terminal, what kind of use case are you looking at? What kind of users are you looking at?
Great question. So Terminal it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife for developers. Like the things that are really powerful about it, just like why should people even use it? Just to be clear, I think it's an interesting question. Is like so text-based apps are still, and probably always will be, the easiest apps to write. So for instance, it's just much easier to write an app that has a text-based interface than it is to write one that has a GUI. And so if you look at apps that are created, like a developer's making an app, probably the first thing they're going to build is a CLI. If you look at actually what like Docker is, for instance, CLI, it's basically running a bunch of text-based apps packaged into something that can be pushed to a server. And so most of the internet is actually running text-based apps. A lot of sort of debugging activities and activities around like configuring clouds. So if you're using like AWS or G Cloud are going to be done through their CLIs. If you're working with any kind of text files or anything like that, the text-based interface is going to be better. There's like inherent advantages to sort of speed in terms of you could do everything through text, through the keyboard that is fitting for developers. There's inherent advantages in terms of programmability. So it's much easier to sort of script things that are text-based than it is to script something that's a GUI. If you're using like the Linux shell or Unix shell, which is the most common one, these apps are all kind of composable. So it's like you can easily take the output of one app and put it into the input of another. And so what you see is like the terminal is very horizontal and used for all sorts of things. It's used for building code, it's used for debugging code, deploying code, configuring the cloud. And all of those use cases, it has like real advantages over other interfaces. So that's like why I think the terminal is still sort of important. Who is it really, who's going to be using it the most is an interesting question. You know, I would say like probably the heaviest terminal users are people who interact with a lot of backend services and cloud services and things that have a lot of CLIs. People who do DevOps, people who do incident response like SREs are typically using a lot of command line tools. But even people who do like web development are probably still like building and running their code through the terminal, and they're probably running their tests through the terminal. And so it's pretty ubiquitous. Yeah, does that make sense? Is like what I think the general sort of use cases are.
What kind of adoption, what kind of usage you have seen of your technologies and products?
Yeah, so we have so in the private beta, we were having thousands of users using it every day. We're now like well exceeded that in the public beta. And so we have basically where I would say we're at with the product life cycle is like we have like a lot of developers who use it as their daily driver. It's mostly suited right now for individual use cases. Like we haven't built out much of the team and collaboration portion of the roadmap yet. And the value prop to a user today is something like, hey, you can download Warp, you can use it and immediately be more productive for your current workflows because a bunch of the way that the app works is it really streamlines the way input works and the way output works in the terminal. And sort of the next phase of product development for us is there's sort of two parts. One part is, you know, fixing, I would say making the product high quality enough that we feel comfortable exiting the beta and just making it generally available. And the second part is really extending the product features into things that are more around like leveraging the cloud and making it work for teams. And so that's the focus right now.
And initially, when we started talking about, you were looking at solving, two. That's what I gathered. One was, of course, to make terminal kind of redefine it, refine it, and second was collaborative feature. Talk about the
Yep.
collaboration part. First of all, what is missing,
Yep.
and why you felt that it was missing, and then how
Yep.
you want to patch that gap.
So the collaboration part is really interesting. So I think the obvious way that people think about collaboration a lot is like you have something like Google Docs style where you have multiple people in one thing at the same time. And I do think that's a use case for the terminal, specifically if like, hey, people are working more and more remotely, so it's very hard to like look over someone's shoulder these days. A lot of the way that terminal knowledge has been passed on in the past is like you go sit next to some more advanced developer and he or she shows you how to do something. Um, so there is a use case for like, hey, let's have one person in a terminal session, share a link to another, have them join, have them have a native view, have them be able to actually guide you through doing things, whether it's onboarding or you are about to run some command that's dangerous. Can they review it or check it off? So that's one use case. The other use case that I think is really interesting for the terminal is a more asynchronous type of collaboration. And so this is like, can you, for instance, share teams amongst, can you share commands amongst a team? So it's like, if you're running some commands in the terminal, it's pretty likely that other people on your team, at some point at least, are going to want to have access to those. Can you document those commands better? So things that typically live in like wikis or Confluence or Notion, can you bring that directly into the terminal so that it stays live and it's more easily shareable? Can you share settings so that when someone new joins your team and they're running a project through the terminal, they have sort of all the environment variables set and they have all of the accounts they need to be logged into? So those are sort of like the two main flavors of collaboration and teamwork that I think are missing right now because like the app is just a piece of local desktop software that doesn't like you can kind of work around this stuff and like have hacks and people do try to like share and collaborate outside of the tool. I just think the tool will be much more powerful when it natively supports these collaboration features.
Since terminal runs locally, I mean, of course, you can also run it on the cloud. It will be running
Yes.
there locally. Is there any specific platform or environment that you're targeting with Warp, or it doesn't matter?
So we've started with Mac primarily because we all use Mac. The next platform that we're going to support is probably the web, actually. So, and the use case there is something like a cloud shell, meaning if you look at like how do you connect to a machine that's running in production, or how do you connect to a remote development environment? Having Warp be able to do that through a web browser, and sort of like gCloud and AWS and Azure all have some version of this, but it's not great. I think we can have a much better version of Cloud Shell. The platform that our users actually want most is Linux. So we will build that, and probably the final thing that we'll build is Windows, which like I think is an interesting use case, but most of the server infrastructure for the sort of the biggest internet sites are all sort of Linux based at this point. So we're kind of prioritizing those types of terminal environments first.
How much of your technologies are open source? Do you folks do any open source at all?
So it's a great question. Right now, we have a few like extension points to Warp that are open source repos. So for instance, if you want to write something, we have this feature called workflows where it's like you can write a commonly used command and document it and submit it to our workflows repo, and then it will actually ship in Warp. So it's like one of our first extension points. We have theming as an extension point that's open source. The core client code is not open source right now. I think I don't want to like publicly commit to it, but it's like it's probable, I would say, that we will fully open source it. We will at least open source further parts of it. I think probably being open source for us is aligns with our actual business goals, where companies will probably feel more comfortable if they can sort of see and audit the code. We're interested in sort of what sort of community contributions could we get if people are building on top of our ecosystem. I think there's advantages for us to be open source. The code base, though, is not ready for it, and there's also like a cost, I think, to us to sort of maintain an open source, repo and community right now for the core thing. And so we haven't done it yet. I think it's likely that we'll do it. I don't know the exact timing.
Can you also tell how old is the company?
Yeah, so the company is a little less than 2 years old. Started in June 2020. We raised a seed round then, and then we raised a Series A in 2021. And so yeah, we've been sort of growing and building our initial product over the past 2 years, and we moved from a private beta phase to a public beta actually just a couple of weeks ago.
Talk about the business around Warp. What kind of business you're building around the company? What kind of products you have?
Business that we're trying to build is an enterprise business where companies are buying Warp for their developers because we've proven to those companies that development teams that use Warp are more productive. They're more collaborative. It's easier to onboard engineers. There's also, I think, a value prop around like incident management, and so making the terminal a very good tool for teams that are doing firefighting or managing outages. And there's also a value prop around securing the terminal. So it's like right now people will have all sorts of like very sensitive information flowing through it. They'll be pasting API keys. And so what we want to do is build something where not individuals pay for it. So it's much more of a strategy of like, let's build something that developers love individually that they can use for free, and then layer on features that are around sort of collaboration that companies would pay for. Kind of similar to like Figma or Notion, or even if you're using GitHub as a base user, you use it for free. So it's a bottom-up product-led growth strategy.
If I ask you, we talked about the company, what does your product or products look like?
Yeah, so the product today is a terminal. So it's something that you would use in place of the native terminal app that ships with your computer, or if you're using like iTerm or a different terminal, you use it in place of that. The big differences in the product right now are the way that input and output work in the terminal. So for output, you can imagine it working much more like a notebook, so like a data notebook, where basically when you run Warp and you run a command, we group the output of the command with its input, and you get like a sort of sequence of commands in the terminal. And the nice thing about that is like anything you do in the terminal is shareable. Like basic things like copy paste work out of the box. You can search just within the output of one command. You can rerun it. So that's one big difference. The other big difference is the way that input works in Warp compared to a normal terminal. So in a normal terminal, input's very weird. Like things like clicking to put the cursor someplace and typing don't work. If you highlight text and hit delete, it doesn't work. In Warp, though, it works just like you're using sort of like VS Code or something like that. So it's a very intuitive, normal editing experience. We make it super easy to enter commands. So we give you we ship with command completions. We ship with auto suggestions. We ship with a feature that actually will use AI to help you generate commands as you type, so you don't have to leave the terminal to figure out how to do something. We make it easy to save a command and share it with your team. So those today are like the basic differentiating features of Warp.
Zach, thank you so much for taking time out today and, of course, talk about warp and also talk about a problem that most of us don't even think about it. We just take it for granted, right? It's a terminal, it does what I want it to do, and that's it. But
Yes.
the way you look at it or way you kind of explain how it can be further, improved, especially the collaborative feature there, those are incredible. So thanks for sharing those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Maybe we can do a demo also at some point in future. So thanks for your time today.
That would be awesome. I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time.